Muy buenos días a todos los que nos acompañan el día de hoy. Les queremos dar la bienvenida desde el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo y muchas gracias por tomarse un tiempo para acompañarnos en este evento. Mi nombre es Luis Manuel Espinosa, trabajo en el área de conocimiento del banco y quiero darles la bienvenida a este evento de Digital Agriculture for Small Farmers, agricultura digital para pequeños agricultores. Tenemos traducción, este evento va a ser en inglés, nuestros ponentes van a hablar en inglés. Tenemos traducción en el botón inferior, en la parte inferior del Zoom, en el botón que tiene un icono como la tierra. Ahí pueden escoger el idioma de su preferencia. I'm going to say that in English. This is going to be an event in English. We have interpretation if you need. In the bottom of the screen, in the icon as the world, you can choose the language of your preferences. Les queremos recordar a los ponentes que mantengan sus micrófonos en mute para poder dejar que los otros ponentes puedan hablar y se escuche con facilidad a nuestra audiencia. Queremos recordarle a nuestra audiencia que cuando estén conversando nuestros ponentes, las preguntas ustedes las pueden enviar a través del chat y esas preguntas van a ser enviadas a nuestro moderador para que a su vez pueda hacérselas a los ponentes. Generalmente, por la cantidad de participantes que tenemos, no podemos hacer todas las preguntas, pero trataremos de hacer la mayoría de las preguntas que nos lleguen al momento de que los ponentes estén hablando. Muchísimas gracias nuevamente a todos por acompañarnos. Los dejo con Pedro Martel, quien es el jefe de la División de Agricultura en el banco. Muchísimas gracias y adelante, Pedro.
Muchas gracias, Luis Manuel. Muchas gracias a todos. Veo un botoncito ahí que dice Unmute Myself. Quiero estar seguro que me escuchan.
Sí, Pedro, perfecto.
Gracias, ok. Good morning, everyone. And, many thanks for joining us today on the event, Digital Agriculture for Small Farmers. As many of you know, small farmers in Latin America and the Caribbean make a fundamental contribution to the economy and food security of the region. Still, you know, small farmers are still among the poorest in the region, poorest populations, partly because they lack access to necessary information and technologies to improve their productivity and incomes. Over the last few years, something we've been learning is, you know, practically and through readings, the role of digital technology has gained importance in agriculture production. And we can see it in everyday agriculture practices, right, in the different systems. But this question of agriculture digital technology has somehow skipped the realm of small farmers, you know, that the potential of this digital technology to enable information, share systematically at a low cost, scientific knowledge with small farmers to boost their yields and their incomes, it somehow has skipped them. You can see it in the large corporate agriculture. It's very, you know, widespread use in Latin America, still not used in small farmers. And this is interesting because when you look at the findings, you see that Latin America is still even behind some areas of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa in this respect. I'm talking about small farmers, right? So there's a gap to be filled. And we at the bank, we believe that to solve the future challenges of the agriculture and food sector in the region, especially with regards to small farmers agriculture, that their challenges have been heightened by the growing impacts of climate change and just recently the effects of the COVID pandemic. Digital technologies are an important part of that puzzle, how to help the small farmers. And it may play an important role in the promotion of technologies to increase the farmers' yields as well as their incomes and do it in a sustainable way. So today, we will learn from experiences that since I believe it's 2016, the organization Precision Agriculture for Development, or PAD, it's called for short, has obtained through its work with public and private partners across Africa, Asia, and just recently in Latin America to implement new ways of providing agriculture extension services, especially for small farmers. In the last 4 years, PAD has reached more than 3 million smallholder farmers across 8 countries and recently kicked off a new project in Brazil in cooperation with the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture, MAPA, and IICA. We're very, very excited to have 2 members of PAD here with us today. And at that, let me introduce and welcome Professor Kremer as our first speaker. He is the co-recipient of the 2019 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for his groundbreaking use of experimental methods in development economics. And in 2015, he co-founded PAD. Currently, Professor Kremer is the director of the New Development Innovation Lab and professor of the Economics and Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. And earlier this year, he was appointed as Goodwill Ambassador by the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, IICA, toward championing digital agriculture in the region. Michael, thank you very much for being with us today here. And the digital floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Claudia and I will share this presentation. We're right now living in a time of crisis due to COVID-19. And one thing about crises and even wars is the extreme situations people are in often spur experimentation and innovation. And in some cases, that actually persists and has a long-run effect beyond the immediate crisis. And of course, we're seeing that we're all adapting as we speak to the COVID crisis and the inability to travel by adopting Zoom and having our seminars online. And they're obviously, we're missing a lot. It would be nice to be in person, but there are also some things that we can do online that we couldn't do as easily if we had to do everything in person. And perhaps over time, we'll learn to more effectively use online communication for conferences and professional communication. So that's obviously something that is going on with relatively high income with professionals. But if you think about the more general issue of digital development, I think that there may actually be opportunities for technology to be used for some of the poorest people in the world, but firms won't necessarily put the same effort into serving those people because there aren't the profits there that they might put into developing technologies for higher income people. So that there may be a market failure there, and there may be something that can be something that can be done about that. That's a hypothesis. In any case, that's a bit of an introduction. But I do hope that some of what's going on now and what Claudia will tell you about may have some. I think it may be a very promising direction for the future, even both during the crisis and beyond the crisis. Okay, with that background, let me say a little bit about the situation. Actually, sorry, Claudia, can you go back one slide? I should just explain a little bit more about my role and how I'm speaking here. So I am a board member and co-founder of Precision Agriculture for Development. As was explained, I'm also at the University of Chicago, where I'm directing a new development innovation lab. I'll be speaking mainly in my academic role today, but I did want to let people know about both. And Claudia works full-time for that. Okay, why don't we go on to the next slide? So 20% of Latin America's rural population lives in extreme poverty. mostly on 16 million small, low productivity farms. And what we found in many settings is that there are often technological opportunities to improve productivity, but adoption is often low. Obviously, there's heterogeneity in that. And one approach to try to address that is through traditional in-person extension. And I think there's a very important role for that. But at the same time, right now there's fairly limited evidence, with some important exceptions, on impact and cost effectiveness. There are often issues of, it can be fairly expensive to get somebody face-to-face with the farmers. And there's in some countries, again, there's variation. Some countries have excellent extension systems, but there are often accountability issues with the extension workers. India might be a case of that. Only 6% of farmers have interacted with an extension officer in the previous year, and 70% of them distrust the recommendations. And while in high-functioning extension systems, information should be flowing both ways, so the farmers explain their problems, that reaches the agricultural system, the researchers, the researchers start trying to come up with ways to address those problems that farmers are facing. Unfortunately, in many low and middle income countries, the information flow tends to be very top down. So those are some of the issues with traditional in-person extension. Maybe we can go on to the next slide. The spread of mobile phones may create an opportunity to complement in-person extension with some digital extension. You can see there's mobile phone penetration rates expected to reach 73% by 2025 in a way that underestimates the number of people who actually have access to a phone in some way. And obviously, it's what I think is exciting about Latin America compared to a lot of the areas where I've worked before, which are lower income areas, is more people have access to smartphones. And as I'll discuss later, I think smartphones open up a lot of potential. Obviously, there are regions with limited data accessibility, but more and more people have access to smartphones. Should we go on? So mobile phones in general, whether they're old-fashioned phones that just have, or whether they're smartphones, that creates the potential for very low-cost information that can be timed to the appropriate time in the agricultural season, or towards weather emergencies, or pest outbreaks, etc. The costs are extremely low when things are done in bulk. Got an African and Asian example, but I guess we should add one from the Americas. I think the technology is advancing, rapidly, and there's some things that can be done now with, very basic technology, and a lot of the existing evidence is on that. But I think there are opportunities for improvement over time. That could, for example, from remote sensing, it's now more and more possible to use satellites or even drones to see what's going on with crops, identify cases, for example, even to measure yields, and thereby to pick up information on what's working and what's not, to measure, in some cases, to measure soil composition with spectroscopy, and thereby have information on what types of inputs might be appropriate. So that's one type of technological advance. Another is using machine learning or artificial intelligence to personalize messages to farmers. So farmers are getting messages that match not just their geographic location, but maybe their history of production or other things that are known about them. There have been advances in A/B testing, and that's something that I've been involved in as part of the experimental method, to try different approaches to learn what's the best way to communicate with farmers. Smartphones enable video to be sent to farmers, enable farmers to take photos of crops, say photos of pests, so that one can identify which pest one's dealing with, the degree of infestation, and therefore the appropriate control mechanisms. think there's also potential for farmers as a source of information. So one thing we were talking about before was peer-to-peer information. You know, farmers can and are exchanging information in WhatsApp groups and otherwise. And there may be ways to improve that and over time. There may also be opportunity, not just for providing information for farmers, but to gather information from farmers and to improve links with agro-dealers or otherwise improve the supply chain or to improve the extension system. So the face-to-face extension could be a complement with digital extension. Extension workers could send out information about when they're holding events. They could collect questions, see what people want to know, and then use that to improve their other work. And to the extent there are accountability problems in face-to-face extension, one could imagine systems that build in some controls for accountability by having extension workers be equipped with smartphone-based systems to make sure, for example, that they're visiting. I saw, by the way, a question come by about how organizations on the ground can get assistance in the project development phase, and that might be, you know, happy to come back to that later. Claudia may also have comments on that. So I've talked about the potential, but you know, there's also grounds for skepticism. Do farmers need the information? Maybe they don't need the information. They know what to do, but they have other constraints. Maybe they can't, you know, they know what inputs they need, but they can't afford them. Maybe they don't have the time to do certain, you know, maybe there's some time-consuming agricultural practices, and they just don't have the time to do that. So there's a question, will farmers change behavior? Will they even pay attention to the messages, or will they treat it as spam? So one of the things I've been doing, and recently with Raiza Fabregas and Frank Schilbach, we published an article in Science that tried to collect some of the evidence on these issues so we can assess what the impact is. So our article is, and I think the reference is at the bottom if you want to look it up. We took multiple studies and we looked at the impact in each of those studies to see whether this changes behavior. And then we summarize that through something called a meta-analysis. And I'll explain how to read this chart in a second. But you know, a lot of these studies were on soil acidity in East Africa. And I was involved with many of these. So in East Africa, soil is often acidic. You can address that by applying lime, but very few farmers use lime, 3 to 10%. We looked at a program that looked at very basic SMS messages. So no video, not repeated phone calls, not even interactive voice response, just sending the very cheapest form, just a few messages a year online. So this cost, you know, pennies. And so, so if you look at these, each row represents one study. So the dot represents the point estimate, and the length of that curve represents the confidence interval. The first one was done by CalRO, that's part of the Kenyan government's agricultural system. The others involved NGOs and often involved precision agriculture for development. The first one predated the formation of precision agriculture for development. So if you look at the average of all of these, you'll see the average coefficient is 1.22. What that means is there was a 22% increase in the odds of adopting the recommended inputs. And you see that diamond shape, that shows the confidence interval. So that's averaging across all these studies. The implied benefit cost ratio was 9 to 1. That's in part, 22% is, it's a real impact, but it's modest. But the cost is very, very low, and that's why these effects, the benefit cost ratio is so high. Here are some other behaviors, and again, we're seeing quite similar patterns with other inputs. In general, increases that are modest in absolute magnitude, but a pretty large boost. Maybe we can go to the next slide. Here's something that looks at the impact on crop yields. So these are all the studies that we could find. The top panel had also included an in-person extension. The bottom panel is things that were, I'm sorry, there might be some mislabeling in the slide. Yeah, I'm sorry, no, the slide's correct, I misspoke. The top panel is just purely digital. The bottom panel has delivery in person and by an extension worker plus a digital component. And one thing to note is there's no difference between these. Obviously, these are a limited number of studies. There's some noise there. But it looks like you're getting pretty similar impacts with digital alone and the combination of digital and in-person. I don't want to claim that would always be the case, but at least in this set of studies we could find. So 4%, you might think that's fairly modest. But I think one thing to realize is that this is an average, and presumably some farmers, ignored the messages, didn't pay any attention, didn't even receive them. So probably more accurate to think, a larger impact on those farmers who acted on it, and a smaller one for those who didn't. But the other thing to realize is you have to set this against the cost, and the cost is very low. There's some other reasons why this might be an underestimate, which I'll come to later. Why don't we go into the next slide? So I've talked about the impact on behavior, the impact on profits, but there can also be impacts on the market or in the system. So for example, there's a very nice paper by Rob Jensen on fishing in India. And what he found was that phone access allowed the farmers to deliver to the markets where the fish were in more demand. And that actually improved the efficiency of the system, increased fishermen's profits, but also reduced consumer prices. So it benefited both sides of the market. And in general, there's now a number of follow-up efforts, and many of them find similar effects, but in other cases they don't. So it's a little bit of a mix. Maybe we can go on. Here's a study that I was involved in that looks at the impact on supply chains. So again, I think in the long run, a lot of the gains are going to be coming from not just supplying information to farmers, but using information from farmers. So this is a case where there was a large sugar company that supplied inputs on credit. And it was very common for inputs to be late, when sometimes they wouldn't be delivered at all. And it was quite difficult for farmers to complain. They had to travel a long distance. They would talk to somebody, the bottom of the organization chart of the company, the message would have to reach its way up. The company tried installing a hotline so farmers could call in if they had a problem, and sometimes there would be calls to farmers to ask them how things were going. They randomized the introduction of this, so all of the results I'm showing so far are from randomized controlled trials. So we should be isolating the causal impact. And we saw a 36% reduction in failure to deliver fertilizer and a 21% in late delivery of fertilizer. And what we saw here, and what we've seen in a number of contexts, is positive externalities to nearby farmers. Once this led to improvements in the system of fertilizer delivery that benefited the farmers' neighbors, not just themselves. Maybe we can go on. Okay. Everything I've been saying so far is short-run impacts, and short-run impacts from comparing the treatment group to the comparison group. I think there are reasons to think the long-run impact is likely to be larger. Now, I would say roughly there are three reasons. The first is these studies will underestimate the current impact because these typically, the information spreads. So we know in the SMS campaign on Lyme that one of the NGOs we work with organized farmers in groups, and we saw that other farmers in the group were getting the message there was an impact on them. So when we compare the treatment group and the comparison group, we're not including we're underestimating the effect if there's information spillovers. And we've seen that in a couple of cases with evidence that's going on. think the other reason why the long-run impact is likely to be larger is that over time, it's really possible to improve the design of these programs. You can do, for example, A/B tests, trying different messages, trying different times of day, different repetition frequencies. And that can allow improvement in the efficiency of the system over time. Then the third reason is there are new technologies. As we can bring in things like smartphones, apps, WhatsApp, customization with remote sensing data, better weather forecasting, it should be, and therefore delivery of better information to farmers, it should be possible to improve the impact. Why don't we go on? So I would say that it's already very highly cost effective, and we think that will probably improve. So I think investing now makes sense. And it particularly makes sense given the challenges with in-person extension during COVID-19. And then the question is, how do we do this? What do we do about it? Well, one question is you could do this. There's certainly a role for both private firms and for governments. I think there are failures to be aware of on both sides. The market failures. First, information is non-rival. And I think that's one of the reasons the sector's lagged. If you produce information, if you figure out how to do this, the information can spread. You can't necessarily charge for it. A number of organizations have tried charging, and that model doesn't work that well. There's also issues of asymmetric information. If you're a private firm, one revenue model is to try to sell agricultural inputs, but then people may not trust you. I think those things create a potential gap. I'm happy to talk about that more later, but I don't want to eat further into the time. I think that creates a potential for a government role. And but there are also government failures. And the government failures that we've seen have not been the traditional government failures of corruption and so on. I mean, I'm sure that exists, but in digital extension, that's not so much what we've seen. What we've seen is that when ministries of agriculture are running systems, they have very sophisticated agricultural information. They often face challenges communicating it to farmers. So for example, in India, and we saw similar things in Pakistan, the government arranged to test soil of millions of farmers. They knew that what the chemistry of the soil, they could then give recommendations. And they produced these soil health cards, and they were going to distribute them to farmers. And we were working with the government, and we tested comprehension. And farmers, both in focus groups and in surveys, we found a lot of farmers just could not comprehend these soil health cards. So then we worked and we tested out. We did various tests of different approaches. And what we found was a redesigned soil health card. The information was presented in a complicated way. It used units of measurement farmers didn't know about. It was very hard to read. It was very technical. Redesigning it and then having a short audio guide available on the phone to explain how to interpret it. That led to much higher understanding. Same thing in Pakistan. In Ethiopia, the government set up an interactive voice response system, but it was very hard to use. We were able to document that using the internal data from the system. But then in each of these cases, what we found was, although the governments didn't have this sort of the skills that a tech company would have of how to best communicate digitally, when the evidence was presented to them on the difficulty farmers had in understanding and using the information, they were very responsive. And so we were able to work with the government in Ethiopia, for example, to to modify the way their IVR system worked, do A/B tests, see which reforms led to a higher fraction of farmers actually making it and getting the content. And then the government wound up changing the system to incorporate some of those lessons. Same thing in India and Pakistan. The governments went with redesigned soil health cards, even though they faced some political pressure to roll these out right away. So I think that's a general optimistic message that we're finding. We're also trying to find new ways to work with the private sector, in particular with contract farming companies, to increase use there. And I think contract farming companies and dairy cooperatives and so on it's selling to an individual farmer, I think, is difficult. But having a platform, the customer acquisition costs are high. But I think there are ways to work with organizations that bring together farmers and thereby have a private sector role as well. So why don't I turn it over to Claudia at this point? Yeah. Or sorry, maybe there's a comments or questions.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, very much for lots of information in a very few minutes, lots to digest. And the chat, just to everyone in the audience, I see that the chat is pretty active, so keep using it. We're gonna try to find common questions a little bit at the end of next presentation by Claudia. But before we move on and give the floor to Claudia, there's something that, as you know, development practitioners and advisors to governments in Latin America, we see a need for, and it's very evident, is the need to provide policies that are inclusionary, inclusive policies that include different populations, different groups of people. And just thinking about that, have you been able to, you know, do experiments, think about ways to improve the participation, for example, of gender, you know, women in agriculture, or younger groups, young fellows in agriculture? That's a concern in a lot of countries where you see a lot of farmers aging, and then their policy desires, I want to say, of keeping younger people in the rural areas in agriculture. And this may be a way to entice those farmers to be more digitally oriented, the younger ones. So have you done any work on that? And have you had any evidence regarding what might work better in terms of creating?
You know, I think, you know, these are very important issues. Let me first start with one issue that's a little bit is connected to this, but is not directly on it, which is, you know, can very poor people who maybe only have feature phones and who, you know, may not be literate, can they use these types of systems? And, you know, one thing I think, you know, because of the environments where we've been working in Africa and Asia, they're generally lower income environments. There's a lot of illiteracy. And we've nonetheless seen that, you know, substantial impacts there. So in some ways, I'm a little bit more optimistic that there might be larger effects in areas where it's, you know, slightly higher income areas in the Americas. But certainly, so I think even disadvantaged groups and somewhat marginalized groups, you know, can benefit. But then, you know, you raised two very important questions. One is gender. And that's a huge issue with agricultural extension in general. It's an issue with in-person extension, which often favors males, and it's a big issue with digital extension because often women, you know, men control the access to the phone in some situations. And then the other one is age. Now I know that we've been confronting those issues in India. And Claudia, do you have? Can I push this over to you?
Sure. So I think in terms of gender, India is one good example. We have been working with female farmers that have decision-making power in different types of activities. So like males will normally take responsibility for like main crops or main activities, but women will be in charge of livestock or kitchen gardens that are like patio gardens that they use for family consumption. So we are working on these areas to try to provide content tailored to women. And I think the topic of age, we haven't faced so much challenge yet. And I think it's because the regions in which we have been working, there's still some young farmers that are staying there. Yeah, we don't have a lot of evidence on age, but yes, on gender.
Sorry, thank you, Claudia, and let me take the opportunity to introduce yourself to the audience. So Claudia is our second panelist and presenter. She's going to talk a little bit about the practical experiences of what Professor Kremer talked about. She's currently the acting Latin American Regional Director and Country Director for Brazil of PAD. She leads the strategy and partnership development in the region, as well as the implementation of PAD's customized digital extension services in Brazil project being implemented that I mentioned earlier. She previously contributed to the organization's growth in South Asia, leading PAD's operation in West Bengal, India, and Bangladesh. So thank you very much, Claudia, for being with us today. And again, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you, Pedro. And thank you, Michael, for providing insightful context on digital extension services for laying the groundwork for on the evidence behind PAD. Well, Michael talked about the evidence on ag extension services, and that, as he mentioned, inspired the creation of Precision Agriculture for Development. And I'll now talk about the organization and its programs. So Precision Agriculture for Development is a global nonprofit organization that is currently reaching 3.7 million farmers, and with the aim of, to positively impact 100 million farmers or world poor. What do? We reduce information poverty by providing actionable and customized information delivered through mobile phone. That is a key feature. PAD provides information to enable the world's poorest people to increase their well-being. And we do this by innovating, learning, iterating, and scaling the use of technology, data science, behavioral economics, and user-centered design. All of this supports low-cost services at scale. We have currently operations in 8 countries, and we're adding 2 more countries to the list, Nigeria and Brazil. I'm going to talk about the Brazil example later in the presentation. Our model is to provide high quality and customized agricultural advice. We use information collected directly from farmers, like location, agroecological zones, crop variety, and so on, and publicly available ag data like soil type, pests, and disease outbreaks, and combine this to generate customized content for farmers, and these cover input recommendations and management advice. In the geographies we work, feature or simple phone penetration is high. And even though some farmers have smartphones, that is not a shared reality for all. Hence, PAD designs services based on feature phones like SMS or voice messages, but has the capability to develop additional functionalities for smartphone users, like WhatsApp or video or pictures. In summary, our services adjust to meet farmers' needs. Moving to the key elements that differentiate PAD's model, PAD relies on behavioral sciences to design messages and services that encourage the adoption of best practices. We also use experiments like A/B testing that Michael mentioned to iterate, test, and improve the content, delivery, and implementation of our services and improve our reach. Additionally, PAD aims to reach out to a large number of farmers by establishing strong partnerships to reach scale. And we also share our learnings to broader audiences, to inform the public debate. The use of mobile phones, that is key on PAD's DNA, allows the organization to provide the service at a very low cost. And this cost decreases further as we increase the number of farmers reached. To exemplify that, in 2019, our average cost per farmer was $1.57 per farmer per year, which is equivalent to a 96% reduction in the marginal cost from our start in 2016, where our costs were around $43, $44. Linking this to the evidence that Michael presented, this shows how PAD model can lead to very high benefit cost ratios. In the second quarter of 2020, PAD was reaching 3.7 million farmers in 8 countries, and as we mentioned, expanding to Nigeria and Brazil. The models in these countries are adjusted to meet farmers and farmers' priorities, but they are all based in similar interventions. But this slide shows the diversity of partners with which we work. We work with governments, either local or federal. We work with nonprofits, social enterprises, and more. Now that I talk about the organization and the big picture, I want to talk about how we work and how this works on the ground. So let's talk about PAT's program in Odisha, India. This program has reached more than 900,000 farmers and will soon transition to the government under a build, operate, transfer model that aims to provide long-term sustainability to the program. This program, or the basic features, is that it's a two-way service in which farmers receive a weekly push call with agricultural recommendations customized with the information that we collected, but can also call back into the toll-free line and record questions that will be answered by agronomists in around a day or two. And they can also access previous messages that they received. This service engages with farmers at different stages of the process to maximize the relevance of the information and the impact of the services. So first, farmers are called by the call center to collect what we call profiling information that will be used to customize the messages. And we collect information on their demographics, size of their plot, irrigation, and so on. And then farmers will be called again or will receive access to training to understand how to use the service, and with this bypass some of these digital literacy constraints that we see in many poor and middle-income countries. So after the content is disseminated, farmers can interact with the hotline on demand. So they can access previous messages, they can record questions, and so on. But throughout this process, PAD is collecting feedback surveys to understand how farmer is interacting with the service, and also collect information on how can we improve it and how can we make it more salient for them. One key feature of our model is that we iterate and refine our interventions as we scale, and not the traditional model of testing and scaling. And this allows us to deliver or aim to deliver the best possible services to farmers. And now I want to talk about Brazil. We're very excited about our expansion to Brazil, that is PAD's first country in Latin America. We recently, as Pedro mentioned earlier, we recently signed an MOU with the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, ICA, to explore synergies in the region that may benefit farmers. As part of these efforts, we are in the process of finalizing an intervention in Brazil. This project is in partnership with ICA and the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Supply, MAPA. It will focus in the northeast region of Brazil, that is where exposure to in-person services is very limited. During the first year, we will reach around 100,000 farmers, particularly focus on sheep and goat, that are the priorities for the government, and then we'll include maize and beans during the second year to complement the services. And I think this presentation will not be complete if we didn't talk about COVID and how PAD is adjusting to the new reality under COVID-19. Our services are very resilient because we don't rely on face-to-face interactions with farmers. So we have been able to continue providing or even expanding our services during this pandemic. In addition, we have collected surveys remotely to understand how farmers, input suppliers, and extension workers are dealing with the crisis, and bring this information to the government to inform decision-making and also inform the public debate. Additionally, we have been providing new type of information. For example, when COVID hit and the markets were disrupted, we identified that farmers were not being able to access some of these inputs. So we shifted our content to try to provide some alternatives that could be possibly done at home, like organic pesticides and fertilizers, to bypass that constraint. And to wrap up, I would like to talk about PAD future plans. So as we mentioned, we are trying to reach 100 million users in the future. We also talk about how we are exploring new communications like WhatsApp, but we're also exploring new data. How can we make our customized messages even more relevant? So can we use weather data, remote sensing, machine learning to inform the way we operate? And we can also engage with new end users. We have been doing this in some countries, particularly in India, reaching out to extension workers, but can we also reach out to input suppliers? Can we limit or reduce market failures? And then one really interesting side is that we are also expanding to new sectors. We realize that this model can be easily translated into other sectors, or we are exploring how to address information poverty more broadly, including education, nutrition, gender, and so on. And the last point is geographical expansion. So we are exploring new geographies in Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, South and Southeast Asia. In Latin America particularly, we are exploring partnerships in Colombia, Honduras, Argentina, Paraguay, and we hope to have a lot of progress in the region. Thank you.
Claudia, muchas gracias. Many thanks for your presentation. Very interesting to see that you guys are now moving to the Americas, and very welcome. And we also acknowledged MAPA's or Brazil's initiative, as well as the ICA's participation in that initiative. So that's great news for our institution as well. So one question that's come up in the chat and off the chat group, it's an issue of privacy. And this is a concern that it's talked about a lot in the settings of the United States, Europe, and maybe a lot in urban areas, right? About the issues of privacy and use of data. Is that something of concern with this kind of interventions, extension services via mobile phones? Is that something that concerns either end of the spectrum, the user, the provider, the privacy of information? And what we all talk about here, sitting at our desks in the US or other places.
Michael, I think you're muted.
Oh, Michael, did you want to say something?
I was having I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing. There's some, let me get rid of that. Maybe Claudia, if you're able to take it, I'll come back in a second.
Perfect. So yeah, I think this is a really good question. And privacy and people's, respect for data is something that we are very worried about. And that's why we don't provide any services without a farmer's consent. So every time that we start a new program, we either invite farmers to join our service. That's how we have done our projects in Kenya. But in other countries like India, we call them and ask them questions, and then we ask them if they are interested in participating in the services. And farmers, when they say that they are not longer interested, they can, when they say that they are not interested, we won't push it further. And all this data, the numbers we're receiving are provided normally by governments or partners. So that provides a little bit more support on this framework, but we also always ensure that farmers are interested and want to receive the service.
Okay, so yeah, that's thank you very much, and that's a concern that's interesting to learn about. Well, a couple of I want to take a couple of questions to both of you, and then you can elaborate, and then we'll see if we get a chance for another round of questions. One question that comes up a lot in the chat is this issue of connectivity. And I think Michael addressed that issue in his presentation briefly, but it is an issue that is, practical concern in rural areas in Latin America as well, not only in other parts of the world. And so a lot of the chat's gone, several questions have come up along those lines. And how do you deal with that? What are the constraints to applying digital extension services as the ones you're trying to provide with problems of connectivity? That's one question. And another one, it's a little bit different, but it's interesting because it says, what are the digital capabilities, not only of the consumers, the farmers, but also of the provider of services, of knowledge services, of extensionists, of scientists, and behaviorally, how are they willing to go that route? Is that a constraint? So those are two questions that come up in the chat group in different forms, and just wanted to see if you can address those.
Maybe I can come in on the second one. I think in many cases, and I think this is most true with governments, their agricultural technical knowledge is very strong, but in the private sector, firms know a lot about both the tech aspect and, if you want to call it, the tech-human interface, the psychology aspect. And if you're Amazon, you put a lot of effort into, or if you're Facebook, you put a lot of effort into figuring out what's the best way to design your product to maximize use, to make sure people spend time with your product, to get people to buy. And there's a bunch of tricks, everything from how you design your menus to the size of, if it's on the screen, the size of a font, etc. So that knowledge is often not in ministries. So a lot of our projects are working with governments and are bringing in some of those techniques, bringing in data scientists to look at the data to say, how could we tweak things that might lead to improvements, or where are people dropping out of the system? And then can we just refine that and do an A/B test to see would a changed approach work better? And I think that's where bringing in ideas from behavioral economics and then bringing in A/B tests and then bringing in some ideas from the tech world are really where we find we're most able to add value to governments. With firms, I think it differs. So obviously there's some tech firms that are very sophisticated already in this, but there are other firms, the sugar company, they're in the business of being a sugarcane producer. They didn't necessarily have all these skills already. So that's another place where we were able to, I think, add some value. But Claudia, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on the first question first to make sure that we have time to go over both of them. So yeah, the connectivity topic is very interesting because, of course, we know that even in urban areas, sometimes connectivity is not perfect. So one way to address that is by adjusting the services that we provide. So for example, in areas with limited connectivity, we can do SMS messages, which means that when farmers go, when any farmer goes to the village or the nearest town, they can get that message kind of fetched into their phones and take even though they didn't receive it on the moment, they could receive it a bit later. Also, the IVR, or the two-way communications, are allowed to solve some of these issues because farmers can call and get information on demand. So whenever they have access to services, they can kind of join or access this content. And the final point is that we have been also exploring other communication channels that can reach farmers directly or indirectly. It could be, for example, in many countries, there's a community kind of extension workers that work in different type of activities that can help provide, bring this information to the groups. Or we could explore radio channels to provide some of these messages to farmers that don't even have access to a phone. So I think this is an evolving area, but yeah, we are aware and working towards that.
Thank you both. I have a couple of additional questions. I think we got time for that. One of them is, I don't know if you made in the presentation you talked to address that issue, Michael or Claudia, but there's the wider role of digital information, not only about agricultural practices, but as well as the wider spectrum of market relationships and market information, and that role there, that space. One of the questions is, have you tried this approach to help small farmers access markets or disseminate their products, off to the markets? Is that an area that you've been working on? It's a little bit beyond the farm level. It's more like integrating into the market side. And the other question is, somehow, sometimes information that farmers receive can be contradictory advice, right? One tells you to use 6 ounces of nitrogen per plant, and another one tells you to use half an ounce. Just to give an example, right? So that generates frustration and distrust. And have you come across that issue? How big an issue is it, and how do you address it? So that maybe Michael could address the first one and Claudia the second one, or you guys mix it up. And are you hearing me well? Just one question, because I've gotten feedback that it's not coming out okay. Go ahead, you guys.
Unmuting. So on the first issue of market linkages, I think this is a very exciting area. And that's one of the reasons why I feel that we're just beginning to unlock the potential of this area. So I talked mainly about the impacts on the farmers themselves of delivering messages to the farmers, but you saw in the most dramatically in the work of Rob Jensen in India that the ability to get market level information about where to bring your crops, in this case fish, where I think the particularly large effect had really dramatic impacts at very low cost on the market as a whole, making both consumers and producers better off by allowing the product to be delivered where it was in short supply. The similar things on the input side of supply chains, some of the work on sugarcane that I discussed suggests that really part of the gain was by making the supply chains work better. But I think there's an interesting company in India, a private firm, a tech firm, that tries to arrange deliveries directly from the farm gate. They have contracts with trucking companies, et cetera, so that when tomatoes are grown in a rural area, they can be brought and taken to the supermarket or to the restaurant where they're needed in the city. And so I think there are a lot of potential. And in some cases, if you're dealing with very small farmers, you really need to aggregate and get a bunch of I don't want to say a bunch, but several farmers together to make it worthwhile to send a truck, for example, either to pick up the produce or to deliver certain types of bulky inputs. Lime is pretty bulky, for example. So I think there are a lot of possibilities in that area. And then there's just pure information provision. If there's five different suppliers, but they're scattered over an area of, some are 10, 20 kilometers away, well, the farmer may just go to the closest supplier, and then that supplier might be able to charge a very high price. They might deliver adulterated or low quality products. If you could do some comparison shopping on your phone the same way we do, look at the Yelp reviews, then that could potentially really improve the functioning markets.
And to respond to the second question, I think we don't consider ourselves a content experts. I think what we bring to the table is the dissemination or the innovation in the dissemination channels. So the way we operate is that we always partner with people that are experts in the content. It can be agriculture universities, think tanks, government officials. So we work with them in what we call content review meetings to make sure that the content that we are providing is aligned with our partners that are often the experts in the field.
Thank you very much. And we're coming up to the end of the 1 hour. So thanks to you both, and thank you everyone in the audience for being an active group. We got a lot of questions here. I'm sure Michael and Claudia can see them because it's going to be in their they're going to have to access, so we'll see if they can address some of them when they get a chance. But thank you very much. For us at the bank, it's been a pleasure having you, having the opportunity to share your knowledge to our member countries. And I think you raised a lot of interesting questions. The potential for private-public partnerships, it's immense at different levels. Understanding the role of government and the role of private sector, it's important. And I think it just goes back to the first area of discussion we had is this idea of being a more inclusive way of getting to the farmers that need the most assistance in terms of technical assistance, science-based knowledge to make a change in their systems of production. This seems to be a cost-effective way of doing it. And I think we got a lot of way to go, and it's a great potential. And I'm sure that we will be accompanying this as we have in the early moments of this. So thank you very much again, and thank you everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you for hosting.
Yes, thanks very much.